Hey everyone, welcome to the Unfiltered Podcast. My name is Lee Stevenson, and I have the joy of serving as the Executive Director of Church Planning for Converge and local church planter in Orlando.
And my name is Danny Parmalee, and I oversee church planting for Converge Mid-America.
And we're starting in this podcast a two-part series that I think is prevalent given kind of where we're at in our world and kind of some of the things that church planters are facing, specific to the economic turndown or what could be coming around the corner, economic turndown. In the first part, we're going to just talk a little bit about budgeting. How do you budget in the midst of economic hardship? And then the second part will be, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you staff accordingly in the midst of maybe an economic challenging season with that. And so I'll be honest, budgeting isn't necessarily my favorite thing to focus in on, Danny, out of the year. My guess is you're probably kind of similar with that.
Yeah, not usually liking to do. I like to spend the money and and do that, but of actually doing all the planning part of it, not so much.
No, and I do, and yet it's such a critical part of the ministry in order to kind of plan and be prepared for when doors open, and even if doors tend to close, how do we manage the tension? How do we manage the economic challenges that exist? Now, we've talked about in previous episodes the idea of church planters early on need to think quarterly. And set up kind of quarterly budgets. What would you recommend? Do you go back to that pattern as economic downfall comes upon a church situation? What's your inclination to when it comes to just the overarching big pieces of the budget, and then we can whittle it down from there?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things, just to speak maybe a little bit anecdotally, for the most part or majority of church planters that I've talked to, they weren't affected as much as they kind of were expecting in the beginning. There was a pretty good amount of, consistent giving. I would say that for your typical suburban, kind of church plant, little bit different if you're a multi-ethnic church or you have a lot of service workers, kind of depending a bit on the demographic. Like if you were a church that had tons of people who are working in the service industry and restaurants, and of course you were hit a little bit more, and there certainly are those stories. The one thing that I haven't heard yet, because it's been so close, is how many people were affected end of the year, because I know that even for church plants and definitely for established churches, they'll get 30% of their budget income in the last kind of, in December, November and December, just because it's just how people have kind of given on their giving cycle. So just to give that just a little bit as kind of a background of it is to say that I still think the hardest thing about COVID is there is just so much unknown. We don't know if a huge wave of all of a sudden middle class or middle upper class will all of a sudden all lose their jobs, or there'll be some sort of crash that way. So again, it goes to that whole thing of question mark. And so I think that just, again, as an overarching principle, you're having to figure out what are the absolutes that literally can't change. In other words, there's no changing, your rent, especially if you're tied into some sort of lease, but then beginning to kind of categorize the things that you're almost even planning catastrophically for, or if it's not catastrophic, it's things that could be weaned down, like, hey, normally we spend this much on curriculum, or normally we spend this much on an Easter outreach and on marketing. There's literally not that money there. So, we'll have to kind of cut it. So I guess
before be more creative.
Yeah. Before we jump in, I would love to know from your personal experience, if some of the end of the year stuff, was it the same for you? Kind of, if you're willing to share some of your giving or stories that you've heard, either people saying, we kind of actually, if you were to kind of look at this 10 years from now, you wouldn't see that drastic of a giving, or if the giving changed, like people were now giving monthly instead of weekly, or giving quarterly because, they were trying to figure it out.
No, I think great question, Danny. I know recent research has dubbed that Americans tend to give a major chunk of their income of what they plan to give out a year in the month of December. It's interesting when it comes to nonprofits as a whole. So churches would be lumped into this. Nonprofit giving in the United States, 20% of all that is given comes in the last 3 days of the year,
Yeah.
which is a remarkable thing. Now, we didn't see a 20% uptick in our budget in the last 3 days of the year. Never did. But I would say as a whole, December, if you learn to play the conversation right and you actually open the conversation and lead and encourage people, like if you are looking to give an end of the year gift, or if your business is looking to give an end of the year gift, we'd be honored if you consider doing
Yeah.
it here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I know if you don't ask, they won't.
Right.
And so everybody else is asking,
Yeah.
so you might as well make the ask, and that will help bump up your December numbers. And we definitely have seen that, but I don't think it's been overly drastic. I think too, like when seasons are difficult, I think people tend to get out of the pattern of habitual, continuous giving.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, well, I need to hold back this month and see where we're at, and hopefully we get to a place that it's a little safer for us. And so then maybe next month, God willing, we'll try to make it up. And so I do see some of that pattern. But it's interesting, the United States as a whole, when things tend to turn economically down, nonprofit giving actually goes up.
Yeah.
And the numbers that just came in for 2020 may be surprising, but this was the most generous year per dollar in the history of America in 2020 as to the amount that was given to nonprofits.
That's amazing.
It was estimated about $450 billion was given to nonprofits in 2020.
Yeah.
And so there's something when an economic downturn comes upon, that those that do have means have the ability to engage and help, and their heart moves that direction. So I think it's important for pastors, don't freak out
Right.
when there is economic challenging times. Learn how to lead with strong vision.
Yeah.
And give people an understanding of what you're doing as a church, why we're doing what we're doing. Would you help us if you have means? And I think that's a clarifying, part of the conversation that needs to take place.
Yeah. Okay. So switching it now to the budgeting stuff. For you, even how did you have to switch up now? How you approached 2021? Because again, we've got on one hand positive news, like, hey, there's a vaccine, and we think this is going to really start to clear things up. And then also in the same news cycle, you have there's variants and not everyone's going to get the vaccine. And it's going to be 2022 before we even think of getting back to normal. How did you, did you switch to your quarterly, or are you just keeping an eye personally, on every dollar that's spent? Are you being super conservative, or are you saying, you know what, this is our time to shine. Let's go for it.
Yeah. I would say this was actually probably one of the more difficult seasons of trying to create a budget in the years that I've been a pastor. And part of it is just so unpredictable. Our first 18 months, we had a very steady, very consistent growth pattern in attendance that was also reflected just probably 3 months later in the giving. And so it was actually pretty easy to be able to say, hey, if everything without changing, we should be here. And then all of a sudden COVID hit and we can't meet in person. And so you can't track attendance numbers the way that you used to be able to track attendance numbers. Giving just kind of stayed flat for us. So we were able to maintain the budget to finish out 2020, but we didn't see a major increase in attendance. And we're still running, 55 to 60% of the attendance in person of what we were at, pre-COVID season. So
can I jump in real quick? A question.
Yeah.
Again, I know we're talking so much income side of this, but that's, the big first step of budgeting. Were you able to parse some of that out? In other words, like, okay, well, your giving might have stayed the same as a total amount, but were you able to kind of, even if you were kind of like broadly looking at it, to say, okay, you know what, we had, this many people drop out, but it was really just filled in with new people, or we had some wealthier people that really did kick it in, but we had lots of these people drop off? Or would you say it literally you could take this month and you're seeing the same families essentially just giving the same? Everyone is just giving the same.
For the most part, it was families giving the same.
Okay.
If I was to give you a quick summary, we did have a few families drop off, but I wouldn't say it was significant. But I would say we added a couple families in the same season that probably made up that.
Yeah.
We did engage the conversation of, if you do have means, would you help us out? If you need help, let us know.
Okay. Yeah, that's
and,
great.
And that really did make a difference, because our designated giving towards benevolence grew significantly in that season. Now, that did make it challenging, because we had a lot of money coming into benevolence and not necessarily towards the general budget.
Right.
And I'm like, rent didn't change. We're still paying rent, guys, even though we're not meeting in person. So I had to kind of explain that to people, but people did step up, those that had the ability to do a little bit more. And then even on the personal, like just personal conversations, skyrocketed, where people came to me and said, "Hey, do you know a family that's hurting right now? We have a little bit of extra. We'd love to be able to give directly to them."
Yeah.
And I was able to kind of play the middleman on some of those kind of conversations, which is fun.
Did you just tell them, give it to me?
Yeah. I'm not getting paid. But we when we came to budgeting for 2021, we put together our ideal budget. Okay. It's like, based on the growth trend, where we were heading in before COVID hit, what would we budget if that trend continued? And then we put that number, and then I just said, cut it by 20%. Because I honestly believe 2021 will probably face some type of more difficult economic challenge just in America. And I'm not prophesying, so don't take that to the bank. But I just at least for us locally in Orlando, we're so driven by tourism, and tourism has been slaughtered here. And we haven't necessarily felt the full effect. It is coming. And I've talked to one church planter in Orlando. 75% of his congregation at this point have lost their job. And so he's sitting there going, okay, and all driven by the hospitality industry. I was like, okay, that it will catch up at some point, and I'm just expecting that. I would rather us be prepared for it before it happens. So we're being smart with that. Now, we had to cut things, or there were things that we were dreaming of doing. We said, yes, it's a great thing, but we just got to put it on hold. And as much as we want to do it, we just can't do that.
So with your 20%, or let me start with your ideal budget, you were basing that off of, so we'll just use easy numbers because I'm not good at math. Let's say your income was $100,000 in 2020. Were you saying, okay, well, our dream budget, normally we're growing at X amount of, whatever.
Say 10%, 15%.
Okay, so we're at 110,000 now. Cut that by 20. Is that basically what you did? So you took your projected, but then you cut that by 20%. And then my follow-up question is did you just cut it total, or then did you rework those numbers? So in other words, if it was, hey, for marketing, we normally, spent 6%. So this year we're only going to spend 5.5, or like, you know what, marketing's gone completely because we wanted instead to shift that money towards this discipleship ministry or this outreach stuff or something like that.
Yeah, it was, we definitely took a look at, I wouldn't quite call it that simple. But we took a look at what do we really believe are the most important drivers right now in the life of our church. And we don't want to defund those to the point that it hurts our ability to maintain momentum or grab new momentum. So for instance, like, let's say worship and production of what we do on Sunday morning, that's still a driver for us. Even if it's captured online and sent out. And so there's still a certain quality. It's like, we've got to maintain that quality. And for us just to maintain that quality, this is what it's going to cost. Camera repairs, sound repairs, a few hired special technicians, some of that kind of stuff. We were like, we can't cut that. That just is what it is. For us, you can't cut rent.
Right.
Rent is what it is. Um, and another non-negotiable was we're not going to cut the money that we send outside the doors of the church. So towards church planting and missions and those type of things, it's like we set 10% that we're going to continue that, and we're going to set that as an example for everybody else that we're living by faith, and that process is all. But some of it was kind of going, okay. Honestly, we could probably get away with this for children's ministry, and we won't feel the pinch.
Mhm.
This would be ideal, but this is reality. We're going to live with reality.
Yeah.
And they're just forcing us to be a little bit more creative in that.
Yeah. Was there anything on your list that was the kind of really hoping for at some point that you literally had to cut it completely? In other words, we were really planning,
Yes.
we were really planning this cool, I don't know, worship night, outreach, something that it's like, it's gone,
Yes. Yeah. And some of it is continuous of what we invested in for 2020. So we invested a significant amount of money to start after school sports programming in local elementary schools. And we made an investment $20,000
Wow.
to be in 5 schools in our specific area. And we were offering after school sports programming free of charge to the participants,
Mhm.
because we know there are a lot of kids that would love to be able to do that, but they just can't afford to be able to do that. And that was our goal. And so we created those partnerships, and we were just getting momentum. We had 400 kids that were now participating in that. And we were putting together a basketball tournament to kind of solidify that, with the idea that we'd start a summer camp
Mhm.
out of that was paid. And then that paid income would go back into the next year's school income. Lost it all.
Yeah.
Because COVID hit literally 3 days before the basketball tournament.
Yeah.
And we had to shut it all down, and now we can't get back into schools.
Right.
And it was like, well, we tried, and we had a little bit of success, and we'd love to be able to do something again, but we can't.
Yeah. Were you doing that through Victory or kind of your own thing?
Yep.
Or through
Yep.
Victory?
Victory Sports. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Little shout out to them. So
Yeah. So if you're listening and you're wanting to do that and your schools allow you, take a look at Victory Sports out of Melbourne, Florida, and let them know that Danny and Lee, and they'd love to be able to connect with you.
and give you a discount, and maybe like we'll get some, I don't know, kickbacks from it or something. I don't know. I don't
At
think
least a cool T-shirt. So
Yeah.
they probably don't even listen to this, but
Yeah. Well, anyways,
Sports-
any other big things from even your experience of budgeting into the pandemic that you think are just musts for planters to be thinking about?
I think you got to know your numbers, and you've got to watch your numbers on a weekly basis when things are challenging economically within your context. I would even work with your accountant to begin to put projections of, if this giving continues, where will we be at 3, 4, 5, 8 weeks down the road? And so that gives you time to be able to flex and change without all of a sudden showing up on a Sunday morning and going, guys, we don't have any money, we're closing down.
Right.
Or you know what, I had to fire all our staff because we couldn't afford them this week.
Right.
To pay the payroll. And so you want to try to figure out ways to buy your time. And I mean, both churches that I planted, Danny, we planted the first church right in the middle of the housing crisis. And then the second time was, now we hit COVID 18 months in. Those projections have been incredibly helpful in making key decisions before it actually hit a nuclear option, to put it that way.
Yeah. Very cool.
How about for you?
Yeah, I just think same thing, keeping an eye on, even if you say you're not a money guy or you don't like it, burying your head in the sand doesn't do any good. And so, again, having other people that are running the actual finances, but you have got to have a pulse on it, and they need to make sure that that you're okay with bad news, because just because you don't know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And that's what I think a lot of pastors think, like, hey, just don't tell me if all of a sudden the giving is dipping, or if this large donor who usually gives at the end of the year hasn't given. I'm just gonna keep pushing forward, because it's an exercise of faith to know the information and to still trust God with it, and at times to make the hard decisions to do it. But that's part of the reason why God has called you to be in that place and in that position, is to make some of those hard calls. Maybe you won't get all of them right, but you're going to have to do that so that you
Yeah,
don't
you
also.
won't get them all right.
So
So, but you do your best, and I agree 100%. Like that's why you're in that position, and trust the Lord's wisdom and guidance, and seek out advice and wisdom from others as well as you make some of those key decisions. Well, friends, this is part one of our economic downturn budgeting staffing conversation, and thanks for tuning into the Unfiltered podcast. Until next time, keep it real.